Hello, welcome back. This is part 2 on our segment on how the Black community has used institutions to organize and advance liberation. So welcome to that segment of the People's Mic. I'm Dr. Violet Jimenez Sims, and I am the Vice President of the New Britain branch of the NAACP. I'm here again with my co-host.
I am Colin Osborne, and I am the college chapter advisor of the New Britain NAACP. And I'm excited to continue this conversation.
We're so excited to have our guests back. To my left, you can introduce yourself.
I'm Professor Jeffrey Ogbar at the University of Connecticut, Professor of History.
And I'm Reverend Brunette Allison Mosley Dozier, retired teacher and semi-retired minister in the AME Zion denomination. And I too am glad to be here and excited to talk about the Black church.
Well, let's get into it. Okay. The Black church. I know that the Black church has been a serious discussion point. I know that in our meetings in the NAACP and just even random conversations, especially with, people, spiritual people or people who are, faith-based, they're always discussing the role or the importance of the Black church as it relates to social justice activism, community. We go back to, and we always go back and look. We always go back to the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s. So I guess let's start there. How would you describe the role of the Black church during the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s?
Well, I have to go back a little bit further. That even in some cases, like with the AME and AME Zion churches, during the times of slavery in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the church was a sanctuary. And I'm not being funny about, the part of the church that's called sanctuary, but it was a place where people who got kicked around by society or got kicked around by their work environment could come on Sundays or meetings during the week for Bible study and feel like people. They were appreciated by their fellow church people. There were men at that time and later in the late 1800s, women who could express their love for God without feeling like they had to constantly be told that they weren't the chosen or they were not really Christians. Because, the other church, the organized church, did a number on people who were not European. They really talked about them as if, as if they just weren't important. And in the Black church, you could be important. You might be a person who cleaned up after horses as your job, but when you went to church on Sunday, you might be the pastor, the preacher, you might be head of the steward board or the trustee board, and you were handling money and you were guiding people, and it just made men and eventually women feel that they were important, necessary, and loved. So yes, the Black church was a sanctuary.
Oh, if I may add, I think it's fantastic. I love how you took it back to the late 18th century, right? And so, one of the things I think is really important for us to imagine is that Black people were able to imagine a God that was on their side and to make an intervention to this sort of bastardized Christianity that they were introduced to. So, you have people who were in many ways anathema to Jesus Christ, anathema to the Gospels. They were antithetical to everything that Jesus taught. And so they were able to say that here's an example of an institution that is morally repugnant, that is unethical, that is unfair, that supports tyranny, injustice, oppression, slavery. And none of this is what Jesus talked about, right? And we're going to create a church really in line with what Jesus talked about, right? When you see someone suffering, you don't say, hey, you're suffering, wait till you die to be free. He healed people who had, physical ailments. He fed people who were hungry, right? He said, let's not murder this woman because she's sinful, but let's think about all of us who've been sin and imagine that this person needs redemption and grace, right? And so they were able to see a Christianity that even the wider America didn't see. And that line, that through line from the 19th century goes all the way up to the 1960s. And you have generation after generation of black folks who were able to say that example of Christianity is not the example that I actually read in the Bible. I'm going to create something more aligned with the Jesus that I know from the Bible. And I think that's powerful and beautiful.
Yeah.
Very true.
Thank you. There's a long tradition of the Black community valuing education, right? Even when that institution has failed or even harmed Black children. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that paradox and maybe any intersection with the church as an organization as well?
Yeah, schools that in many ways set to educate, but tend to quote Carter G. Woodson, miseducate, right? So Carter G. Woodson is the second African-American to get a PhD in history or PhD at Harvard University. And Carter G. Woodson was contemporary of Du Bois, comes a little after W.E.B. Du Bois. He has this book, The Miseducation of the Negro. So he talks about the importance of education, and as said in the first segment, people in positions of power always understood the power of education. Therefore, they made it exclusive for themselves. But when they did give it to other people, they made a point that they would miseducate, right? That they wouldn't tell them accurate histories. They would tell them inaccurate myths and so on. And so it becomes important in the 1960s and 1970s. There were many efforts done in Black communities across the country to have community control of schools because they wanted to actually change the curriculum. They were looking for interventions and would fancy academic word, the epistemology, right? So looking at, and this as an educator, of course, but looking at ways that we can imagine the world from a more humane perspective, a more civilized perspective, a more moral perspective, but also one that adhered to truth and not sort of white supremacist myths. And so I think that you found these in school efforts in New York City. You found them in Chicago. Almost every major city had community efforts for Black community, what they call community control of schools. But the idea that we could have administrators, principals, school teachers who were hired, but also not just having a Black face, but you could actually have, white faces who were, civilized, moral, informed, just, and they could educate children properly. And I think that was a major effort, certainly in the late 1960s, early 1970s, to see these sites as sort of sites for advancement and liberation.
Can I add what the churches actually did too to help with that? Between our Spotswood and the NAACP, they, at the time in the 60s and the 70s, early 70s, there was no such thing as Black history in the schools. We had a Black History Week, and I do know that the churches, whether they were Black or white, would have rallies or programs. But what Spotswood did was to get permission to go into the schools. My mother was at this time retired or close to retired. You remember my mother. Mm-hmm. And she and a very good friend of hers, who was the head of Christian education in our church, said, these children need to know Black history. And I learned Black history at my church. Mm. It was like they only talked about Negroes when it was something negative, like we were out there picking cotton in the fields. That was it. But we learned Black history from these Sunday school teachers. So my mother and this lady, my mother was a Sunday school teacher, director of children for the church, and Mrs. Coley went out into the community and took their time to go to schools, to elementary schools, and teach Black history. And there are a lot of people who would never have known anything about themselves if these women, and I think there were others too, but I just remember them, if these women had not taken the time to go and tell them who they were. And this is how the church can even do this today, because they're attacking critical race theory, which is a college level series, but they're saying in some places don't teach it to the children. Well, the children need to know that something is evil when it's evil. They need to know that people have done good things and they look like these children. And, you know, if the school isn't going to teach it, then the church has to, because we are the community, we are the village.
So interesting you say that, because actually when you both were talking, especially with you saying what you just said now, I'm kind of having flashbacks now, because you're right. I remember when I was younger at Spotswood, I learned a lot about Black history during Sunday school. And so now fast forward 20, 30 years, we're not doing that. I'm not just saying us, but just I think the church universal, Black church universal, is not teaching Black history, those Black moments, so to build. Why do you think that is?
Well, we got, I don't want to say complacent, but just like with the efforts that people used to make to feed the poor, people used to do it, churches used to do it, but when the government stepped in and started teaching and started providing, the people said, oh, okay, well now everybody will get this and we don't need to make efforts. But we're getting a wake-up call now. The poor are not being fed. The children are not being taught everything that they need to be taught. You know, school in some cases is almost like a trade school. You know, this is something you'll use when you get a job. But how about something that helps you feel good about yourself? I mean, we have all of these calls for the fact that there's so much mental health problems, so many mental health problems in the society. But sometimes they just need to know that they're okay with who they are, that somebody loves them, that they can accomplish whatever they need to accomplish. You know, I remember a time when you were told you can't do that because Black people don't do that. I was told that most of my life. You can't be a writer because Black people don't write. You can't be an actress because Black people can only play mammies and cooks. But now, you look at the TV, you look at the movies, you have wonderful talents. Acting, you have writers everywhere. You have just people doing, not just dreaming, but doing, and they're saying, for many of them, if you scratch the surface a little, you'll find out that they may not have gone to church, but they had a grandmother or a grandfather who did, and who taught them how to love themselves because Jesus loved them. So, you know, I can get carried away on that.
I mean, all of those things, right? And the role of how the community comes together, church as an institution, right, allows that to happen in an organized manner, but especially now, right? You're talking about these things in the past, and yet I can think of all of that happening right now, right? Where the political context is a push for censorship, right? For anything that brings up the word race, right? Attacks on race conversations, gender conversations, anything that lets people sort of know more about themselves and potentially self-actualize, right? That so that conversation is really important even today. As we do look across history, what is your take on how institutions, right, whether they are schools, churches, civic organizations, right? We talked about sort of the pull and push of who takes care of the poor, who takes care of who, when, right? But how can all these institutions work together to continue to push systemic change?
I think that so history demonstrates a lot of synergy between churches, elected officials, and education, actually, right? So, I mean, why not look much further than, You could look at Dr. King, you look at the modern civil rights movement, but we have schools across the United States that became centerpieces for desegregation, obviously. So we have Ruby Bridges, obviously, in New Orleans. We have Little Rock 9. But they're like the front lines of this sort of disintegration of the legal structures of white supremacy and racial oppression. But all across the spot, we have ministers who are mobilizing people, not just Dr. King, but we have so many other ministers across the country in small cities and large cities and little hamlets that allow organizers, SNCC, CORE, NAACP organizers to speak at their churches, to galvanize people to come out to marches and demonstrations, but also to register to vote, right? And so when people are registering to vote, they're demanding that these elected officials be accountable. They're trying to, elect people first off to get the right to vote. And of course, then you have these people who create school systems that fundamentally disrupt how we imagine history being taught, how we imagine resources being distributed, if kids will have lunch at school or not, if that lunch will be free or not, the quality of that food, the quality of the books, all these different things come out of voting. So in so many ways we have like churches, schools, elected officials being tied together in these social movements. In terms of accountability, I think that I'm always one for metrics. So anyone who knows me knows I like to look at like not just how we feel, but what do the data actually tell us about the world in which we live? And so I'd like to see what graduation rates are like. What are performance on, do we see an increase in performances through various metrics of reading, math, and history? Do we see declines? How many people, what percentage go to college? What percentage graduate? I'm looking at all these sorts of metrics, and those are the things I know a lot of people get caught up in just the numbers of Black administrators and teachers in a percentage. And I understand that's important, that is, but I want to look at outcomes, and I think outcomes are things that really should motivate us when we think about schools and so on. So I'll just, stop there.
Yeah, that's important, yeah.
You said one thing that brought me back to the 60s again about voting. A lot of churches in New Britain during the 60s participated in freedom rides and in voter registration. And it wasn't just adults, because I was maybe about 9-10 years old, but my two older sisters went on voting registration drives throughout Connecticut, and they did a good job. And now that people are trying to gerrymander the voting around the country, maybe the Black church needs to get out there and say, we're going onto the highways and into the byways and registering people so they can gerrymander all they want, but these people are going to be registered after they've redrawn the districts. And this again is where the Black church is the community and the village. Where are we needed? Let's go there and do it.
Yeah. The Birmingham campaign, to your point, I mean, so the 1963 Birmingham campaign, we think about Bull Connor attacking the children with water hoses and everything, but these were high school kids, and they systematically went to high school. So these are church leaders, Dr. King and a whole bunch of other folks, who went. You have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they were going into high schools, right, and communicating with people at churches. So they were speaking at churches, getting high school kids who walked out and confronted the monsters of racial oppression and got attacked with dogs and water hoses in front of the world, right? Embarrassed the United States, embarrassed Alabama. Well, I don't know. Well, some people in Alabama got embarrassed. Some people in Birmingham got embarrassed. But this is a fundamental and pivotal moment, an iconic moment in the Black freedom struggle, is that campaign in Birmingham. But again, you have high school kids, you have ministers, and you have schools forcing the hand of elected officials to do something right instead of something so grossly immoral.
So, with all that said, what do you think? It's for both of you, of course. What would you say would be the greatest opportunity for the Black church now to lead in social changes now going forward?
The greatest? Well, for me personally, I think we have to be aware of what's going on. I've noticed that whenever something foolish has come out of Washington, we've had one of our many ministers preaching on it. And I could turn on YouTube and find other ministers preaching on it. I noticed that when people have done things to disrespect people of color, ministers have gotten in their pulpits and said, people, we don't need to take this. We can use our economic power to stop the foolishness, to the point where one particular corporation went to one minister and said, please, please make your people come back and spend their money in our store. And the people said, when you start acting like you respect us, we'll come back. So our greatest opportunity, and I'm going to let my friend here finish, our greatest opportunity is to respond to whatever foolishness we see happening in this country and set the record straight.
When I was about 20 and 21, I didn't think this was a sexy thing to organize around. I used to think it was too milquetoast and not more forceful. But education and voting, as conventional as it may appear, are two of the most potent weapons, I think, that we have in our arsenal of tools to advance our communities. So any way you look at it, to go back to a theme I've been talking about throughout, is that if voting didn't matter, as some people will tell you that your vote doesn't matter, oppressors would have spent hundreds of years and millions of man hours to prevent your great-great-grandmama, great-great-granddaddy, and everyone else from voting. They would have been blowing people up in churches, killing people, committing all these sorts of acts if voting didn't matter, right? And the same thing is said for education, right? And as unsexy as, I might have thought about it when I was like, super radical militant in my early 20s, I now have come to the realization that there's a particular power in it, particularly, at our political landscape right now. We can look at all the sorts of things that have happened just in the last 6 months. And so to think that somehow voting is not impactful or that both parties are the same is to ignore the facts before us. So I think that churches can be very important in encouraging people to, to vote and vote responsibly, to get everyone out to vote, to understand that your oppressor wants you to sit at home and on your hands and think your vote doesn't matter. And that's why they've been actively discouraging people from voting or preventing people for hundreds of years. But also I think that we take very seriously the power of education, right? I mean, it makes you more curious. It advances your life in so many different ways. I go through a whole litany of data. You live longer, less likely to get physically assaulted, less likely to get stabbed, beaten, going to jail, less likely to be in poverty, more likely to have health care. You're more likely to not be depressed. I mean, so all these different things come out of the benefits of education, not just like doing it for status or prestige, but there are substantive ways in which our lives are improved by it. And I think that, again, this is why people who don't want you to advance don't want you to get an education and don't want you to vote. So always be subversive. Take your health, your education, and politics very seriously.
Okay. This conversation I want to continue. Unfortunately, we are at the conclusion of our discussion. So we are now concluding the People's Mic, and we would like to thank our special guest, Dr. Jeffrey Ogbar.
Ogbar.
I got it. Thank you. Somebody's going to get it wrong. That's all right. No, we did well. We almost
and Reverend Burnett Dozier for their powerful contributions to tonight's conversation. We also would like to thank you, the viewers, and we hope that today's discussion, it inspires you and that it pushes you to move and to become change makers. And so please keep the conversation going, all right? Let's keep talking about this, all right? All right, and to learn more about the New Britain NAACP, you can find us on our social media, Facebook and Instagram, and we are at New Britain NAACP. Again, that's New Britain NAACP, all right? And we are your hosts, Dr. Violet Jimenez-Sims, and I am Colin Osborne. Good night, and God bless you all, and thank you for tuning in.